All right, so what do the hypotheses and assumptions look like? Well, they're identical to the one-way independent ANOVA. All right, so that means only the hypotheses. I might have said hypotheses and assumptions, but it's just the hypotheses that are identical to the one-way independent ANOVA. So what that means is that we can phrase our hypotheses as directional or non-directional. That means, we can predict, which mean is going to be higher or lower than the other means, etc. Those would be directional hypotheses. Or we can simply say there's going to be a difference somewhere. That would be a non-directional hypothesis. But when it comes to the actual tests, anytime you do it in ANOVA, your test is always going to be one-tailed. And we talked about why that's the case. If you look at the F distributions, I have a picture of that a number of slides back, right? So if you go back and look, you'll see that the F distributions are positively skewed, and there is only one tail. You can't make it a two-tailed test if there's only one tail possible. So all of your tests will be one-tailed tests. But again, your hypotheses can be directional or non-directional. All right, what about the assumptions now? They are identical to those for a dependent t-test, but there's an additional one. All right, now before we talk about the specific assumptions, it should make sense to you that the assumptions for the one-way repeated ANOVA are the same as for a dependent t-test. Because in both the t-test and the ANOVA, the dependent t-test and the repeated ANOVA, you either have the same people in each group or they've been matched. All right, so the assumptions, it would make every bit of sense to me that the assumptions should be the same. All right, regardless though, we'll always have what? For all of the t-tests and all the ANOVAs, all of those parametric tests we learned have the, think about the fruit, the core. All right, so I'll just abbreviate the assumptions here, but you have to know them in its entirety. So we have normal distribution, random selection, and a DB that's interval or ratio. Okay, now that's as far as that is all of the assumptions for the dependent t-test. All right, we stop right there. The dependent t-test has these three. The one-way independent, one-way repeated ANOVA has an additional assumption. I glanced up here and I got sidetracked, okay? But we're talking about the assumptions now, the assumptions for the one-way repeated ANOVA. So we have the core plus one more, and it is called sphericity. All right. Now, unlike HOV, homogeneity of variance, where I explained what the assumption was, I'm not going to explain what the assumption is for sphericity. It is not worth the time it would take to explain it. All right. What is most important at this level is that you understand that you want to have sphericity. You want that. And so you're going to test for sphericity using, do you remember? Mauchly's test. And do we want Mauchly's test to be significant? No, because we never want to test for assumptions to be significant. All right, so I'm going to get a little ahead of myself here. Let's talk about this. Sphericity assumption only applies to a within subjects factor where there are three or more levels. So you might have been wondering, how come we didn't test for sphericity with the dependent t-test? All right, because you would think, well, the dependent t-test and the one-way repeated ANOVA both either test the same people in each group or different but matched. So why aren't the assumptions identical. Well, sphericity only gets tested if your within subjects factor has 3 or more levels. And with a t-test, you only have 2 levels, t for 2. All right, so sphericity does not get tested for the dependent t-test, but if you're running a one-way repeated ANOVA, all right, regardless of whether it was within subjects or a matched design, if you are running a one-way repeated ANOVA, you will need to test for sphericity. All right, so because with a one-way repeated, you know you have 3 or more groups, 3 or more levels. So you will always test this with the one-way repeated ANOVA, but never for the dependent t-test. And I've explained why. Right? Dependent t-test only has 2 means, and sphericity cannot be tested unless you have at least 3 means or 3 groups that you're comparing.